we are clearly in a situation where the West and NATO and the United States are destined to lose the war. Given all that we've invested in Ukraine, and given that we have just doubled down, what are we going to do then? And this is a worrisome situation because the temptation to use Western military force to rectify the situation, to double down again, will be a very powerful temptation. And that could lead to really serious trouble. So the fact that the Ukrainians are in all likelihood going to lose is only part of the problem. We also have to think about what the West will then do to rectify the deteriorating situation.
That's exactly what I worry about. It's one of my primary concerns, because I see all these people painting themselves into a big time corner to where I just don't see how they pivot from Russia can't win, Ukraine must win, to, oh shoot, Ukraine lost. Okay, all right, well, let's just make a new Cold War, make a new iron line, iron curtain, and let's build up our forces. I just don't see them doing that, because they have literally put their reputations on the line for Russia having to lose. And if they don't, I fear that they're going to try to do something to rectify that. And something besides giving money to a now then defunct Ukraine army, which can no longer even use the weapons. And the temptation will be very great for that. Right now, people, John, I think, that say, oh, no, we're not going to send troops there. Biden has said we're not going to. Even Macron says, oh, well, it's just theoretical. Well, if they get faced with, you have to acknowledge the loss or do something different, it's not theoretical anymore.
Yeah. Just to go to the Iran-Israel conflict and what happened on April 14th when the Iranians attacked Israel, it's very important to understand that the United States was deeply involved in that fight. There's some reports that roughly half of the Iranian drones and cruise missiles were shot down by the Americans, not by the Israelis. Furthermore, it was the Americans who put together the coalition of countries that dealt with that Iranian offensive. You know, the Jordanians, the Saudis, the French, the British, the Israelis, and the Americans. The Americans were in charge. I only raised this issue because it shows you how easy it is for us to get dragged into a fight. In other words, it was not the Israelis versus the Iranians. It was the Israelis plus the Americans plus a number of other countries up against the Iranians. So you can hypothesize situations where Ukraine collapses or begins to collapse, and we feel we have no choice but to get directly involved, maybe in a subtle way, but nevertheless directly involved. And then you get into the whole business of escalation and what that looks like. So the end result of this vote on Saturday probably won't make any difference in terms of what happens on the battlefield, but it could make a big difference in terms of our participation down the road and the potential for escalation into a war between NATO on one side and the United and the Russians on the other side.
I can't even believe we're having that conversation right now, and the theoretical, or even getting close to being an actual possibility, not a theoretical one.
Danny, if I could just say a quick point. One thing you want to remember about the Americans is we hardly ever back off. We always double down. Right?
It's not reassuring. I know. Can you say 20 years of doubling down in Afghanistan and how'd that work out? Let's don't repeat that one, but yeah, that's kind of what we did. Observe that one firsthand. I want to ask a slightly different question here that was posed to me by a colleague or a retired colonel not long ago, which I found very fascinating, and was looking forward to talking to you with your international relations theorist hat on, because I think that there's more to this than many people are thinking. So whether it's Viktor Orban or a handful of others have been saying, and certainly I have been, that, we need to, seek the best negotiated settlement we can get starting right now. Don't wait for anything else because it'll only get worse, et cetera. But there's actually a potential problem with that, and that is on the Russian side of that. Because all these things that we tried with sanctioning them and destroying their economy and all this other kind of stuff, they have retooled and are now pivoted away to other areas where they may not be in a position to need to negotiate. And they may say, once we've accomplished this on the ground and taken this territory, maybe we'll do that. One of my friends actually postulated that there's the potential that if you got into negotiations, Russia may say, okay, we're either going to win this by force, which is more than they have now, or you can cede all of the Zaporizhia, all of these four complexes, the whole Donetsk, without fighting, and let that be the line, and then maybe we'll go and agree to that. What do you think about that possibility?
I think the argument that you're putting forward, that your friend put forward to you, is a powerful argument. I fully understand it. And what this tells me is that we cannot adopt a negotiating strategy that's filled with half measures or is half-hearted. We have to pursue a radical shift in our policy toward Ukraine if we have any hopes of cutting a deal at this point in time. And that means we have to say categorically that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO. And number two, we have to sever completely the security relationship between the West and Ukraine, and especially the security relationship between the United States and Ukraine. The Russians have to be confident that Ukraine is going to be a neutral country and that the Americans are not going to welch on the deal. This would be a radical policy shift on the part of the United States if it was adopted. And of course, that's why it, in all likelihood, will not be adopted. And we will try to negotiate some sort of settlement where Ukraine eventually gets into NATO or what have you. And the Russians will make it unequivocally clear that this is unacceptable. And we will continue on our merry way supporting Ukraine in this war.
You know, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say something that I hope doesn't come to pass. I hope what I'm about to say proves to be false and wrong. But what I think is the more likelihood is that all those things you just said, then this obviously is going to be a video that's going to be out there forever, and it's never going to go away, is that in the future that people will look back on this moment and on those things you said and the radical change what you said. People will just give their eye teeth if only we could go back to this time and make that decision now, bring this to an end, to limit the damage and actually preserve something of a decent situation for ourselves, the NATO alliance, and even Ukraine. Because if we don't do this radical shift, which you say, I see no evidence that it's going to do anything besides get many more Ukrainians killed, much more territory lost, possibly even the cities of Kharkiv and Odessa, if it goes that far, or we'll be faced with what you said a minute ago, with the possibility of getting into a war with Russia. The arrogance of our leadership and our unwillingness to do anything except for claim victory fills me with fear that that's where we're going.
It's hard to disagree with you. I mean, I think that we're deeply committed to continuing this fight or keeping the Ukrainians in the fight so that we can damage the Russians and hope for a miracle somewhere down the road. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think we have to adopt this radical strategy. One of the real problems here, Danny, is the Russians simply don't trust us anymore. They think that Putin thinks he's made this very clear on at least 3 public occasions, that he trusted the West and he thought the West was negotiating with him in good faith. And it turned out they were not. And he was a fool. He admits he was a fool. And he says he has no intention of ever letting that happen again. Given that attitude on the part of Putin, which I'm sure is shared by many of his lieutenants, if you're in the United States' position, you have to change your policy radically, and you have to do everything possible to convince the Russians that you're sincere and that you're not going to welch on the deal later on.
But John, all of our modern leaders have spent nearly a career demonizing the Russian side, demonizing Putin in particular, and I've even on some talk shows I've been on before been if not attacked, at least addressed with, yeah, but how can you possibly trust Putin? He violates every agreement he's ever had. I could sit there and factually tell you that's not the case. That, I mean, everybody cheats a little bit here and there, but by and large, they've actually held to most of their agreements. But that's irrelevant. The impression is that you can't possibly trust anything. Ergo, no one's going to take this radical approach because they have been taught not to trust anything of the Russians. So you have these two immovable objects, and you have the Ukrainian people being crushed in between them.
Makes me think of that phrase, we are being hoisted on our own petard.
That's not a very pleasant thought.
Well,
it could be worse.
Another dimension to this too, which is that we have recently been arguing ad nauseum that the Russians are not only evil, but they're bent on conquering all of Europe, and they have the capability to do it. And if that's true, if you're dealing with the second coming of Adolf Hitler, and Adolf Hitler has the Wehrmacht and is going to try to overrun all of Europe and create Lebensraum, it's very hard to negotiate some sort of compromise settlement with Adolf Hitler. I mean, this is where we're at. All that Russophobia has put us in a position where it's just very hard to see how you work out some sort of negotiated settlement.
Yeah, and here's a comment from Putin, which I think kind of addresses some of this. Gary, roll that.
Я когда, ну сейчас тоже Ширака нет, Жака Ширака, он был крупным таким политическим деятелем. Я как-то его спросил, почему американское руководство так себя ведет? Ну, так агрессивно и так недальновидно действует в некоторых случаях. Он мне по-русски ответил, потому что некультурные.
So you see how he kind of views us with disdain, and who's to argue with some of it, but that's kind of really both sides are looking at the other in similar ways, and it's just not filling me with a lot of confidence that we have the statesmanship or the desire or the capacity on either side to end this, and it's just very troubling to me.
I just add one other dimension to what we're talking about here, and that is that I actually think the Russians, and this includes Putin, and I think you see it with the Chinese too, they believe that we are strategic idiots, and they believe that we do things that are not in our interest. And if you go around the world and you talk to lots of people who are not in the West about, you know, American policy, for example, vis-a-vis Israel and what's going on in Gaza and what just recently happened with Iran, they simply can't believe that we're allowing ourselves to be pulled into this situation. They just think we're nuts. And they think that what we're doing in Ukraine is remarkably foolish. The whole idea of expanding Ukraine and NATO into Ukraine, when the Russians made it clear that they viewed this as an existential threat. And then you have the trouble start in February 2014, and the Americans, instead of backing off and trying to work some sort of modus vivendi out with the Russians, double down, and we end up in a war. And I think a lot of people think, and I certainly think this, and I know you do too, that this just doesn't make good strategic sense. So the Americans are, you know, they're kind of boobs when it comes to planning and executing their grand strategy or their foreign policy. And if you look at all the trouble that we're in around the world, I mean, the situation in the Middle East is turned into a disaster, and there's no hope of it improving anytime soon. The situation in Ukraine, as we have just talked about, is disastrous, and there's no hope of that improving anytime soon from our point of view. And meanwhile, there's huge potential for trouble in East Asia, especially in places like the South China Sea or over Taiwan. And, you know, we've lost our focus there. We're not focusing on the ball out there. So the United States is just in one heck of a lot of trouble.
So let me ask you this in the last few minutes we have here. I think it's self-evident, as you just articulated there. We don't have at least a coherent national strategy. What do you think is the no kidding reason why we don't have that, and what is our foreign policy objective and drive in the administration? What do you think actually animates their decision making? Because there's got to be something. I mean, they can't literally just be going, yeah, I don't know, whatever, let's just do this today. There has to be something, but I can't identify it, and I'm wondering if you can.
Well, first of all, they think there's no limits, right? The whole idea of prioritizing is not part of their worldview. My view is if you're concerned about East Asia, you're concerned about Ukraine, and you're concerned about the Middle East, you can't deal with all three of those areas of the world at once and give them all equal attention. You have to prioritize, but that's not the way the United States thinks. The United States is run by people who think that we can run the world and we don't have to prioritize. Second thing is that I think that the American foreign policy establishment is filled with people who don't have a good sense of the limits of military force. They think the United States is incredibly powerful.
We're the strongest, greatest country in the history of the world.
We're the United States of America, for God's sake. The most powerful nation in the history, not in the world, in the history of the world. The history of the world.
And it can wield that military instrument in really effective ways to get what it wants pretty much everywhere on the planet. And if it doesn't use military force, it can use economic sanctions. And those economic sanctions are a deadly effective weapon. And I think there's no question that if you're a great power like the United States, you do want to have a formidable military. I think you do want to have the most formidable military on the planet. But I think it's very important to understand that there are huge limits in terms of what that military can do for you. And if you wander into places like Iraq or Afghanistan, you want to understand that you're going to get yourself in a lot of trouble. And the military is not going to provide a magic weapon for solving most of the problems you face in Iraq or in Afghanistan. But I think most American elites don't really have that healthy appreciation of the military instrument.
Yeah.
What's happened here is we have a foreign policy that is concerned with running the world, not prioritizing, and using lots of military force or economic sanctions to get our way. And what's happened is that new centers of power in places like China and Russia and even India have come online. And furthermore, you have adversaries who have lots of missiles like Hezbollah and the Iranians. And this makes it very difficult for us to get our way and to execute this foreign policy that we've designed. And we don't seem to learn. I think this is due in good part to the fact that we have hardly any accountability in the American system. People don't get punished for their mistakes. They go to a think tank after they're done, then they come back in the next administration. So there's little accountability, little learning. And this, I think, explains in part why we're in such a mess today.